Today, we will be looking at two horrifying stories that went horribly wrong. Both stories shared one brutal truth: survival came at the cost of a limb. The choice was absolute: stay and die, or live on, forever marked by what had to be left behind. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On the morning of Friday, September 19th, 2014, a 26-year-old man named Senolo Shadrach Rosello drove out from Johannesburg and parked near the Rustenburg Kloof Resort at the foot of the Magaliesberg. He was not a mountaineer. He was not a spelunker with a team and equipment and a logged itinerary. He was a young man from Johannesburg who had a reason to be there that mattered to him, and so he went. The way people have always gone into mountains with personal reasons. Without announcing it, without anyone waiting for him, alone with whatever it was he was looking for. The Magaliesberg is an old country, and there is a range of mountains about an hour northwest of Johannesburg that South Africans have been visiting for a long time, for reasons that have nothing to do with adventure tourism. The Magaliesberg consists of sandstone ridges and narrow gorges, streams that run cold even in summer, the kind of landscape that accumulates meaning over generations and holds it the way stone holds heat, long after the source of it is gone. Some people go there for hiking. Some go because the rock formations are worth looking at. And some go quietly, alone, because the streams that run through the mountain crevices are believed by certain communities to carry something beyond water, a quality, a presence, something that the word holy is as good an approximation of as any. Rosello moved through that terrain looking for the water he had come for. He found the streams. He found the gorges. The mountain was giving him exactly what he had come looking for, and there was no reason at that point, no signal, no warning, nothing in the landscape that would have told him to stop or turn back, to think that the morning was going to become anything other than what he had intended it to be. He was picking his way along the rocky cliff face above the resort, somewhere in the narrow terrain between the gorge walls, when a snake appeared on the path directly in front of him. He startled. His body reacted before his brain caught up. The sudden flinch backward and sideways that happens when something unexpected appears at close range and every instinct fires at once. His footing shifted. His weight went the wrong way. He slipped. His right foot went down between two large rocks on the cliff face and jammed into the gap. He could not pull it free. He pulled. Nothing happened. He repositioned himself as best he could and pulled again, harder, putting his full effort into wrenching the foot free. The rock didn't move, didn't shift, didn't give him a millimeter. The gap had taken his foot at exactly the angle that worked most completely against extraction, his own body weight hanging below the trapped foot, pressing down with every attempt to pull upward, locking it in tighter the harder he tried. He stopped and took stock of where he was. He was alone on a cliff face in the Magaliesberg Mountains. There was no trail visible from his position, no other hikers, no sound except the water moving through the gorge below and the wind coming off the sandstone ridges. Nobody knew exactly where he was. Nobody was waiting for him. Nobody was going to notice he hadn't come back until it was already very late. What happened next? The single thing that separated this story from a far darker version of itself was that Rosello had his phone. He made a call from that cliff face, wedged between two rocks on a Friday morning in September. And that call set in motion something that would grow over the next 50 hours into one of the most complex mountain rescues South Africa had ever conducted. Multiple helicopters, more than 100 people. A police helicopter was dispatched and began working from Rosello's voice, his general description of where he was, the fragments of landscape he could describe from his position on the cliff. He was partially obscured by rock. From the air, he was nearly invisible. What found him eventually was a reflective strip on his jacket catching the light at the right angle. The crew spotted it, fixed the position, and the ground team had a coordinate. Rob Thomas, a mountaineer with the Mountain Club of South Africa, led the team that abseiled down to Rosello late that Friday night. What he found was a young man who had been wedged in that rock for hours, who had had nothing to drink since the previous morning, who could not feel his foot, and who was, in Thomas's later description, terrified in a way that went beyond the physical fact of his situation. Terrified of the dark, terrified of the mountain, and terrified, above everything else, of being left alone on it. He asked for some drinking water since he had nothing to drink since yesterday morning. Thomas spent 2 hours with him that night before he had to leave. He told Rosello before going that someone would stay. He said later that he believed that assurance, the promise that he would not be abandoned, mattered as much to Rosello in that moment as anything else the rescue team could offer. Paramedics rotated in after Thomas, staying with him in shifts of 6 to 8 hours, providing food and water and medication, and, perhaps most importantly, the simple fact of another person in the dark with him. Saturday was a day of work. The rescue team understood the problem clearly enough. A foot jammed into a gap in the rock on a cliff face, the body hanging below it, the geometry of it meaning that the weight of the body was working against the extraction at every angle. They tried pulling on the leg directly, bracing and hauling, attempting to generate enough upward force to pop the foot free from the gap that held it. The rock held. They tried hacking at the stone around the foot, chipping away material to widen the gap, to give the foot somewhere to go. The gap did not meaningfully widen. They poured lubricant into the space between foot and rock, the same logic that had been tried in the cave rescues for decades. Reduce the friction, reduce the grip. Let the body's own weight assist the extraction. It did not work. Midway through Saturday, with the technical options running thin and Rosello's condition being monitored with increasing attention, Thomas recalled the conversation that would define the rest of the rescue. He put the question to Rosello plainly, the question about the leg, about what the team was considering, about what it would mean and what it would cost. Rosello did not hesitate. He said, "If you have to take the leg off, take the leg off, but get me out of here." That sentence is the moral center of this story, and it is worth holding for a moment. It is the sentence of a man who has done the arithmetic of his own situation and arrived at an answer that most people would spend days or weeks refusing to reach. 50 hours into entrapment, unable to feel his foot, alone on a cliff in the dark with strangers keeping him alive in shifts, Rosello had already separated the question of the leg from the question of his life, and had decided, clearly and without apparent anguish, which one he was choosing. He consented not reluctantly, not after prolonged persuasion, but with a practicality that the rescue team leader described as remarkable. The call went out for a surgeon. Professor Frank Planny was a trauma surgeon at Chris Hani Baragwanath Academic Hospital in Johannesburg, one of the largest hospitals on the African continent. On Sunday morning, September 21st, he was hoisted down the cliff face on a rope where Rosello had spent the last 2 days. The conditions he found there were not operating theater conditions by any measure. The terrain was, in his own words, very, very unsteady. Rockfall was a live possibility from above, not a background risk, something the team was actively watching for throughout the procedure. The space was cramped. The light was whatever the team had brought with them. Plani had an anesthetist and a paramedic assisting him, and between the three of them, they were going to perform a below-knee amputation on a cliff face in the Magaliesberg on a Sunday morning, and they were going to do it in the same space where Rosello had been trapped because there was no other space available. Rosello was sedated. A tourniquet was improvised from climbing rope, the kind of adaptation that a rescue operation in this terrain requires, where the equipment you need is the equipment you brought for a different purpose and have now repurposed because no one pre-packs a surgical kit for a cliff face in the Magaliesberg. He was held in a harness attached to bolts, positioned so that his body could be moved slightly up and down to give Planny the access the procedure required. Planny amputated the right leg below the knee. The foot stayed in the rock. Rosello came free. He was airlifted from the mountain and taken to Chris Hani Baragwanath Academic Hospital, where he was listed in stable condition in intensive care 3 days later. Rob Thomas, who had led the rescue from the first abseil down to Rosello on Friday night through to Sunday's extraction, described the feeling afterward in 2 parts that he held simultaneously, without pretending one canceled out the other. He was elated, he said, that a life had been saved. And there was, alongside that, a disappointment. his word, that this poor guy had to lose his leg in the process. Not a complication, not a footnote, a disappointment. Sitting right next to the elation, the two feelings occupying the same space the way grief and relief often do when a rescue reaches its end. And you are standing in the light, looking back at what it cost to get there. Senolo Rossello went into the Magaliesberg alone on a Friday morning, looking for something he believed the mountain's water carried. He came out on a Sunday afternoon, alive, missing a leg below the knee, carried on a stretcher to a helicopter that lifted him away from the rock that had held him for 50 hours. The foot is still in the mountain. Gerald Dwayne Easter was 17 years old, a 10th grade student at Arcadia Valley High School, and on the afternoon of Saturday, September 14, 1986, he and his friend Eric Bennett, also 17, also from the small town of Pilot Knob, were doing what teenagers in rural Missouri do when the weekend opens up in front of them, and there is a cave at the top of the second highest peak in the state, sitting less than 2 miles away. Devil's Icebox is not a casual name. It is the kind of name that a place earns, a cave used historically as a mine near the top of Pilot Knob Mountain, cut into rock that has been worked and shifted and stressed over decades of extraction, the kind of geological environment where the relationship between stone and stability is more complicated and more fragile than it appears from the inside. Gerald and Eric were exploring it the way teenagers explore caves, without formal training, without equipment beyond what curiosity requires, drawn there by proximity and the particular pull that a place called Devil's Icebox exerts on the imagination of a 17-year-old with a free Saturday afternoon. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the wall of the cave moved. A boulder came loose from the wall without warning and came down onto Gerald Easter, pinning his legs from the knees down beneath an estimated 20 to 40 tons of solid rock. The range in that estimate is not imprecision. It reflects the genuine difficulty of calculating the mass of an irregularly shaped piece of mountain that has just rearranged itself and landed on a teenager. And the difference between 20 tons and 40 tons is largely academic when the result is the same. A 17-year-old boy with both legs trapped beneath more weight than any human effort could shift without mechanical assistance, lying on the floor of a cave called Devil's Icebox on a Saturday afternoon in a town of 600 people 12 miles south of Farmington. Eric Bennett escaped with minor scratches, and then he ran 2 miles from the top of Pilot Knob Mountain down to town to get help for his friend who was pinned under a mountain inside a cave and could not get himself out. The call went out, and the response that came back was, for a community the size of Pilot Knob and the surrounding Arcadia Valley, remarkable in its scale. The Pilot Knob Fire Department responded. Other fire departments from the surrounding area came. The mine rescue crew from Scott Air Force Base was brought in. Iron County Sheriff's deputies were on scene. By the time the full operation had assembled around Devil's Icebox, an estimated 200 people were at the site. 200 people mobilized to a cave on top of a Missouri mountain because a teenager was pinned under a boulder and the clock was running. Of those 200, approximately 70 would be directly involved in the technical work of freeing him. The others supported, staged equipment, maintained communications, and waited in the way that the outer rings of a rescue operation always wait, doing what can be done from their position and trusting the people deeper in to do what needs to be done from theirs. Getting Gerald Easter out was not going to be simple, and everyone who looked at the situation understood this immediately. The boulder was not sitting on his legs in a way that allowed for a straightforward lift and remove. It was positioned such that moving it incorrectly, applying force in the wrong direction, shifting it without controlling exactly where and how the weight redistributed, would bring it down harder onto his chest, trading crushed legs for a crushed torso and a very different kind of outcome. The rescue team from Scott Air Force Base and the firefighters on scene had to approach the problem the way engineers approach a structural problem, reading the weight distribution and the contact points and the angles of potential movement before committing to any action, because the action they committed to was the only one they were going to get. A mistake with a boulder estimated between 20 and 40 tons, between approximately 18,000 and 36,000 kilograms, is not a mistake that gets a second attempt. While the technical planning took shape around him, Gerald Easter lay on the cave floor with the weight of a piece of mountain on his legs and, by every account from the people who were with him through the night, handled it in a way that nobody who has not been in that situation has any real standing to fully appreciate. His attitude was described throughout the long hours as genuinely good. He was talking to the rescue workers around him. He was eating. He was drinking hot chocolate that someone had brought in for him, sitting in a cave called Devil's Icebox with a boulder on his legs, drinking hot chocolate and talking to the men who were working to get him out. There were a couple of moments of panic, unavoidable, completely understandable, the kind of acute psychological breaks that anyone would experience after hours pinned under an immovable weight in the dark of a cave. But he was kept sedated enough to manage those moments without them becoming something that complicated the rescue further. For the most part, through Saturday night and into Sunday morning, Gerald Easter held on with the kind of steadiness that 17-year-olds are not supposed to need, and that this particular 17-year-old apparently had in sufficient supply to get through almost 18 hours underground with a mountain on his legs. The rescue workers who stayed with him through that night were running on something similar. Don Wynn, the Pilot Knob fire chief and part of the rescue crew, would say at around 8 o'clock on Sunday evening that they had been up for 40 hours by that point. 40 hours of sustained focus on a problem that required getting every variable exactly right before making a move, in a cave, with a teenager waiting on the outcome. The planning continued through Saturday night. The equipment was positioned and rigged. The angles were calculated and recalculated. And at approximately 9:30 on Sunday morning, 17 and a half hours after the boulder had come down on Gerald Easter's legs, the rescue team pried it off. He came out of Devil's Icebox alive. He was transported first to Arcadia Valley Hospital and then transferred by helicopter to St. Mary's Hospital in St. Louis, where he arrived in serious condition with crushing injuries to both legs below the knees. The injuries had produced severe swelling, the specific dangerous kind of swelling that crushing trauma causes in soft tissue that has been compressed under enormous weight for an extended period, where the pressure interrupts circulation and the damage compounds with every hour the weight remains in place. At 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, he underwent 2 hours of surgery to relieve the pressure in his legs. The surgery went as well as it could have gone, and doctors reported afterward that the condition of his legs had improved since the procedure. But the word that appeared in every medical assessment in the hours and days following was the one that his family and the rescue workers, who had spent a sleepless night getting him out, were holding their breath over: amputation. Both legs were a concern. The crushing injuries were severe enough, and the duration of compression long enough, that the viability of the tissue below his knees was genuinely uncertain. A nursing supervisor at St. Mary's was careful and specific in how she framed it. The legs were viable right now, she said. Amputation was a concern. The word right now carrying all of the weight that two-word qualifiers carry when they are attached to medical assessments about a 17-year-old's legs. Gerald Easter was described as alert. He was sleeping a lot because of the pain medication, but when he was awake, he was present and conscious and aware of where he was and what had happened to him. His parents, Gerald and Freda Easter, who had recently moved the family to Pilot Knob, a town of about 600 people, tucked into the Arcadia Valley near the Mark Twain National Forest, had spent the night at the top of a mountain waiting for a boulder to be moved off their son, and were now waiting in a hospital in St. Louis for doctors to tell them whether the legs the boulder had crushed for 17 and a half hours were going to survive the damage they had sustained. Gerald Easter came out of Devil's Icebox alive, which was not a guaranteed outcome from the moment the wall moved at 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. What happened to his legs afterward was something that we never got to know. What had already happened, well, there was no undoing to that.